everyone. Welcome to session 2 of the ACGC and BCF Beyond Borders Building Bridges webinar series. My name is Cynthia Lareine, for those that don't know me. I'm the co-founder of the African Corporate and Government Council Forum, or ACGC for short. We're the largest in-house legal community in Africa with a membership of over 2,000 members spanning almost 30 African countries. Myself and Sharon Thomas, founder of Black Counsel Forum, will be your moderators this afternoon. So I just want to kick off with a really short recap from the first session. It's really, I looked through the registration list and noticed that some people who had come to the first session are joining us today. So by way of reminder, I think it was about a year ago, or maybe just under a year ago, we ran a session where we looked at heritage as a source of visibility and how cultural identity and community shape our legal journeys. We heard insights from Segun Oshuntkun from BCLP, Jennifer Chimanga from Clifford Chance on navigating law firm life while staying rooted in who you are and where you come from. And then from the in-house side, we heard from Edith Onwuchekwa at Seplat and Shei Kosoko, who was formerly at First Bank. Today, we are taking a step further. We're going to look at how we leverage heritage and turn our difference into distinction, how we identify leverage, how we use identity as leverage rather than the lens through which we're seen. So whether you're in-house or if you're in private practice, either in the UK or somewhere in Africa, this session is really about building the type of legal career that is impactful and intentional. And we've got some great panelists who are going to be sharing their own stories, positive stories, war stories as well, on what's worked, what's working, what may work. We're going to tackle the topic by looking at 3 areas. So cultural identity as strategy, building cross-continental legal practices, and then dealing with burnout, which is obviously a really significant part of this conversation. I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator, Sharon, just to provide a bit of context, because I thought it was really important to frame this particular conversation in the light of the world right now. A lot has changed since the first session. We have a new president in the US. We have lots of legislative changes that are impacting the view on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Sharon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And hi, everyone. And thank you very much for being here. I'm Sharon Thomas, as you know, and I'm the founder of Black Counsel Forum, which is a space that's been created for Black legal professionals to connect, to build and to lead. So we have an annual summit in the UK. Every year we bring together 400 of the most talented Black professionals in the UK and in Europe. As Cynthia said, you know, today's conversation couldn't be more timely for those of us working in Africa or for those of us who form part of the African diaspora. This year alone, you know, we've seen The Economist reduce Africa to a cautionary tale, just repeating old colonial, I think I'd call them colonial era narratives that erase the creativity, the innovation and the leadership that we can see happening across the continent. And I think also at the moment, you know, we're living through a time where DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, is not just being sidelined, it's been proactively dismantled. This year alone, you know, we saw Meta, global company, dismantle its global D&I function. And that's definitely a move, I think, that's signaled to other institutions that diversity, equity and inclusion are no longer priorities that are worth defending. And you'll see a lot of other companies have followed suit in sort of rebranding their D&I initiatives. And for those of us that are in the diaspora, those of us that are living, working or doing business with the West, I think that this is going to have a real impact. You know, it impacts our careers, it impacts our business opportunities. It's going to impact our ability to just move through these institutions safely and fully. But I just want to say very quickly, just giving a bit of context. So for me, this backlash, I think it's been a long time coming. I don't think it came out of nowhere. And it's been driven out of the States, and it follows a pattern that I think at least Americans have seen before. And some of the same tactics that they used to resist the civil rights movement are being used again. So we're hearing claims of reverse discrimination. We see that the movement, the anti-D&I movement, is actively positioning people that are privileged as being the victims. It's saying that they're the ones that are being harmed, which is just not true, because they just want to ignore some of the structural realities, the structural inequalities. Oh, sorry, I hear my voice. Fine. Okay. Is that okay? Am I echoing? I heard my voice echoing a bit. So yeah, these guys just want to ignore all of the sort of structural inequalities that made D&I necessary in the first place. So for me, it isn't just a backlash. I think it's just a calculated, strategic reassertion of the status quo, or how some people would like to see the status quo. So I think it's, today's conversation really matters, because we need spaces like this. We need spaces where we can speak honestly, where we can share strategy, where we can learn from each other across borders, across legal systems, across generations, and use our networks and our know-how to support each other, because community for me, and this is something I talk about a lot at Black Counsel Forum, it's a strategy in itself. Having that connection is a form of power, and it's a power that I think we really need to leverage this year in particular and going forward. So thanks again for being here, and I'm going to hand back over to Cynthia. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sharon. And I love what you said about community being a strategy. I think that is so true. And, what you said is really a powerful reminder of why we need this conversation. So we are privileged to have four stellar panelists who are going to lead this discussion. We're going to talk about some of the strategic areas, but before we get into the nuts and bolts of how you get it done, I would love to kick off with getting our panelists to talk to us about a moment, a decision, an experience that has accelerated their path to leadership. And I want to do this because the reality is that leadership doesn't just start with the moment you get a title. There are many moments that happen quietly in the background before you get there, before that big cross-border deal, before that massive client mandate, before that career-defining pitch. And I think for our audience, it would be a great way to introduce yourselves. If you could, first of all, tell us who you are, where you are, and what you do, and then talk to us about something significant that has shaped the way you view life, the way you do leadership, etc. So I'm going to kick off by coming to Bayo. Mr. Odubeko, over to you. You're still muted. There you go.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. 1 second.
Oh, we've lost Bayo. Okay, whilst we're getting Bayo back, let me come to Lamise. Lamise, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Lamise Vanya. I am the head of legal of Amazon South Africa, and I'm based in Cape Town. I'm really pleased to be part of this forum and really excited about this topic. Just to circle back to the question about a moment that shaped my ability to lead across borders. So just to give you some background, I have a mixed heritage. I've spent a large portion of my life bridging two cultures. So I consider myself to be quite a diverse person. And in my first in-house role, I worked for a freight service railway provider. And they were engaged in a community dispute. It was a property dispute. And I was tasked with going down to meet a number of people in the local rural community in the Western Cape, and basically make certain representations on behalf of the company as part of the legal process. And I tell you the story now, many, many years later, but at the time I was accompanied by a number of my colleagues who were all white men at the time. And I stood up in front of this community and I presented on behalf of the company. And this moment really challenged me, and it really sits in my memory because as I stood there in the community hall and I looked across the crowd, I realized I was actually addressing people like myself, people very similar to my parents and to their background. And I noticed that they were listening very astutely to me because I think they saw someone that they could connect with, someone who they found common ground with. And it shaped my career that day because I spent the rest of the day engaging with that community, essentially listening to them, respecting them, trying to find that common ground, trying to find that sense of community, which Sharon mentioned, which is actually a power that you can leverage, and is something that is, I think, very close to African identity in terms of finding community. And at the end of it, I realized that not only was my diversity a strength that I used that day, but it was also something that I could use as an ability to influence and shape company policy in the future, and sometimes for the greater good. So I saw it as a huge, huge opportunity. It really accelerated my career, and it changed my philosophy in terms of how I operate as a legal person in the space with my kind of cultural background and mixed heritage.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lamise. That's great. Sandra, let's come to you. Same question.
Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, everyone. I think I need to applaud Cynthia and the team for putting together this platform for experience sharing. I myself am a panelist, but today I also want to learn a thing or two. So for everyone, I serve as the General Counsel and Company Secretary for FanMilk's business in Ghana, and it's part of the Danone Group, leading producers of dairy products, waters, and then baby food in Paris. I also oversee legal operations for the business in Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin, and some export activities in Burkina Faso and Mali. Now, back to the question that Cynthia asked about, what stood out for you or was a turning point. When I was called to the bar, I was one out of 183 lawyers. And I remember at the time, I asked myself, Sandra, what will make you stand out, right? What would be, your edge in this sea of super intelligent and talented colleagues? Truthfully, yes, I asked myself, that was back in 2013, but it wasn't until probably 6 years in that I had what I now see as a turning point. So I was catching up with an old friend, Agatha. We had spent time schooling in France. We had returned. She had, moved on to work in Benin, and she had planned to relocate to Senegal, right? And she was doing very well, speaking impeccable French. And then it hit me then, Sandra, you have a whole asset, bilingual fluency in English and French that you were not using. And once I began to embrace that, I realized that, new doors started opening. It started first off with the opportunity at Danone, and Danone is based in Paris. Then I was able to connect more meaningfully with my colleagues across those markets because I could relate better with them, right? We could speak French. And then I started, having to grasp the laws, the business laws in the OHADA. It became my companion. And it wasn't that it was very easy for me. I hadn't used French professionally since 2006. And I really, really struggled to speak fluently at first, but I stayed with it. I built confidence little by little. And I realized that shift, leaning into the assets, that I already had was transformational. And to be honest, it gave me a very stronger voice and a wider platform to lead and influence. Because 6 months when I joined the business, when I was hired as a legal and compliance manager, I was later on given the French West African countries to lead as a general counsel. So for me, my encouragement and the lesson here is we should know your difference or whatever asset is already in your hands. You don't have to wait for it to be perfect. Just use what you have where you are, and you never know how far it can take you or who it can help in the long run. So that was for me my turning point. Me realizing that I had an asset that I was sitting on and not using.
Love that. And I love the fact that it's a language driven asset. So we're going to come back to that later on in the session, Sandra. Thank you. I think we have Bayo back. So Bayo, if we could come to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Brilliant. My name is Bayo Odubeko. I'm a partner at Norton Fulbright in London, focused on M&A and private equity. I actually started my career as an equity capital markets lawyer. London, as we all know, is widely regarded as a leading capital market in the world, notwithstanding its recent challenges. Listed companies are highly regulated, and the standards and requirements that they have to adhere to are very exacting. Sophisticated and developed world issuers are familiar with such standards and expectations. Quite often, they'll have the necessary corporate governance practices, systems, and processes in place. African companies looking to list in London, unfortunately, don't have the same level of understanding and preparedness. So I was working on an IPO around about 2010, and we really struggled to communicate to the client just how exacting the standards are in London. When I say we, the partner leading the job, we really struggled procuring the information that were required for the listing document. I was the senior associate on the job. Partner was totally exasperated and just decided to step aside and allow me to run it. For some reason, I was able to communicate with the issuer and the issuer's board and their general counsel. I got the information that we needed to produce the admission document. I was the one that they put on a flight to Harare every 2 weeks to go and do due diligence on the company and essentially write this company's admission document. It was then that I kind of realized that I had a better understanding and sensibility of African clients, and they warmed to me. I had a better way to communicate with them. And then I did a further 2 IPOs. And what I found was that the African clients liked me because I didn't talk down to them. I understood them, and I was able to work with them and to communicate the rules and regulations to them that was communicated in a way previously that was quite condescending. I communicated it to them with respect. And I think that really was a turning point for me as a lawyer, focusing on the African market.
Love that. I love that story, Bayo. Thank you for sharing that, because I think, again, this is a key theme, just the power of communication. So it's obviously the one thing is being African, but actually that ability to home in on what the client requires and meeting them where they're at. So thank you for sharing that. Timi, can we have your moment and also an introduction from you?
Okay, thank you everyone. And thanks for the ACGC for putting together this very useful webinar. Now, my name is Timi Balogun. I'm a partner in the law firm of Squire, Patton, Boggs in the London office. I do international dispute resolution, and that covers investment treaty arbitrations, commercial arbitrations, commercial disputes in the courts in London. And in my previous role, I've done quite a number of infrastructure projects development. I'm originally Nigerian. I'm qualified in Nigeria and also qualified in the UK as well. So coming back to the question, one moment that stood out for me was my decision after having been in the UK, working for a FTSE 250 listed as a sole commercial lawyer many, many years ago. I then got a role for me to go back to Nigeria as the General Counsel for the Nigerian National Infrastructure Bank. That was quite a difficult decision for me for a number of reasons, one of which was back at that time, it was actually quite rare to have lawyers of my background to have been able to successfully navigate through an in-house role and then becoming GC for a FTSE 250 was actually really within grasp. And so to leave that and then go back to Nigeria, where back as of that time, things weren't completely structured. So it was quite a bit of a decision for me to take. But I took that decision anyway and went back to Nigeria. And that was, I would say, a moment in my career that's had perhaps the most significant impact, because what it then did was to give me the on-the-ground experience, not just within Nigeria, but across different markets within Africa. So in reality, I spent about 7 years at the bank. When it was time for me to move back to London, I then realized that actually it had opened up a new career path for me, because there were major international law firms that were looking for a lawyer with my kind of background, someone who's got UK experience combined with on-the-ground African experience across several jurisdictions. So that had actually really made me quite an ideal candidate. I spent the last 10 years, we'll say, as part of the leadership of the Africa Practice Group of 2 major international law firms, and that's worked quite successfully. So I've been able to turn around my Nigerian background, my Nigerian experience, combined with the UK experience, to be able to catalyze myself into leadership of, major international law firms. So that's my story.
Excellent. Again, really, really fascinating stuff. And we're going to come to you again, Timi, just to sort of ask about some of that experience. But I think I'd like to summarize your stories with 4 C's. So I think what you've told us is that it's about capacity, language as a part of that capacity and skill, community, communication, and courage. I've summarized your story to me around sort of being courageous enough to take a bit of a leap of faith. I want us to drill down into some of the really strategic elements of, what it's taken to get where you are at. And so I'm going to ask you some very specific questions, and you'll all be asked slightly different questions. Whilst we do that, I want to engage our audience, because I can see we've now got a fair few people on. So we're going to just run a quick poll. The question will flash up as a poll, but I would love for the audience to write their responses in the chat. So the question, and Oladimeji, you can run this now, is we want you to give us one word, or it can be multiple words if you want, but one word that encapsulates how you believe your culture enhances your impact. So we'll let you do that for a couple of minutes. As I say, that just put your responses in the chat, and then we will possibly get our panelists to maybe comment on some of those. So whilst people are doing that, Timi, let me come to you and just talking about cultural identity as strategy. So, you're in a very unique position in that you've had the privilege of seeing this from a number of vantage points. You've served as a GC, a Nigerian DFI. You're now a partner in a leading international law firm. I'd love for you to just tell us a bit more about specifically how your Nigerian identity has helped shape the work that you do, leading on, high stakes deals. Let's call it like it is. You're doing some pretty big deals, and I know before we started the session, you're saying how busy you are. So clearly, you're doing it well. So we would love to know how you bring your Nigerness, if you like, to bear on the work that you do.
Thank you very much. So, in the first place, I think some of the mandates, essentially I represent states and a number of state entities and national companies all across Africa. So in the first place, I think my Nigerianness has helped me to be able to secure the mandates in the first place, right? Because the time that I spent at the Infrastructure Bank in Abuja, which is a Nigerian development finance institutions with cooperation agreements with other development finance institutions all across the continent, such as the African Development Bank, Development Bank of Southern Africa, and all of that, has given me a wealth of relationships, right, that I've built all across the continent, which has helped me, which I've relied upon to be able to develop a successful practice, right? So securing the mandates in the first place, I believe I've used my Nigerianness to be able to do that, right? So that's the first thing. The second way in which my Nigerianness has helped me is that it assisted me in being able to navigate through complex relationships with high-ranking government officials, career civil servants, political appointees, without which I would, a number of my colleagues that on some of my matters would be lost if they had to be the ones to actually really directly navigate some of those relationships. And I believe, like somebody had said, one of the panelists had said, it actually also assisted me in being able to build trusts, right? Because people see themselves, because the clients that I'm working for perhaps share the same culture, probably, speak the same language. We understand some of the issues that are going on in the region. So they're able very quickly to build the same level of acquaintance with me, which has really been very helpful. And also I understand the bureaucracies, right? So whereas some of my colleagues who have only trained and worked in the West may be faced by some of the bureaucracies that you will see in the region, I completely get it, right? I understand it. But I must say though, because I'm aware that there are lawyers on the listening. So there's a particular way in which one experience which I've had where my Nigerian identity, and I think lawyers who are involved in Africa work should bear it in mind, right? Because I had a particular client, which is a state entity for another African country, right? That is not Nigeria. A Nigerian entity then commenced litigation in the High Court in London against my client. So my client, which is an entity of another African country, they were concerned. They had an initial reservation about the fact that I'm Nigerian and it's a Nigerian company that's taking them through litigation, but I was quite pleased that last year, towards the end of last year, we were able to get quite a good result, for the client. And so the initial reservation that they had, dissipated. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, and you have to bear that in mind, that when you're dealing with clients. So that's the way it's helped me.
I mean, that's really great to hear. And actually, it's good that you've raised that point about the fact that sometimes actually your identity might work against you. And so you've got to be able to mitigate against that and just be conscious that, even as Africans, right? So I'm glad you flagged that. Sandra, I want to come to you because, Timi talked actually, he referenced language. And I know this is, a big area for you, just, talking about how you've been able to leverage that skill. So your remit at Danone spans Anglophone and Francophone West Africa. You're leading teams that are working not just across different markets, but different cultures and different languages and different regulatory environments. So how do you intentionally use your not just your culture, but also your linguistic fluency to effectively lead and to influence. How does that actually work in practice, particularly, for those members of our audience who may be bilingual? How does that, we'd love to hear more about that.
Okay. So really, the truth is cultural and then, linguistic fluency. I don't view it really as soft skills. They are really strategic tools, especially if you're working, across markets like the Anglophone and the Francophone market. So I've also come to believe every market has its own pulse. Every team has its own way of working and seeing the world. So you don't go in assuming that things should be in a particular way, right? So you take your time to understand how the team communicates, what motivates them, and then what their legal and then business priorities or realities are. And for me, that builds trust. So one typical example, and then I had learned over time, and now I have found peace around it, that I don't have expectations of a majority of my French colleagues responding to an email before 10 a.m. No, their mornings typically start after 10 a.m. And it's mostly a cultural thing, right? So whatever information, if you need, if it's super important, you know how to communicate with them, make them feel that their input is very valuable to what you're working on. And among my French colleagues, they are the most super chilled colleagues ever. Your agency is not their agent. But they have a way of just viewing things. You know how Anglophones, we are running around like our head. No, they are chilled. Like they don't even get it. Not in a particularly bad way, but they just have a different way of reacting to things. And even on the language front, it's really not about speaking the language, it's how you speak it that truly matters. And I think it was Timi who was talking about trust, building trust. You need to understand the market or the francophone market.
Oh, have we lost Sandra? I think we may have lost Sandra. Okay, we will come.
Can you hear
Sandra,
me?
you still there? You're there. Wonderful. Continue.
Yes.
You froze for a minute.
Oh, okay. So I mentioned that Timi was talking about, building trust. And in a recent project, we're working on a capitalization and the timelines were really critical. The thing about the Francophone market is the deadline. You need to do it within a certain period, within 6 months of the last, since the year ended. So I was working with an external lawyer and a notary on that deal. And I found the notary's fees, I don't know what's with the Francophones, but I found the notary fees very excessive and their response to emails like frustratingly very slow. So even though there was no necessity for me to travel back there, I thought that, why don't you build relationship with these notaries, get to know them in person, so that you can manage the situation more effectively. So yes, I scheduled the meeting, arrived well ahead of time. And then to be honest, I was prepared to speak English, but when I quickly realized that the notary was didn't understand a word of English. So, I mean, then that was the advantage that I got. So I quickly switched to French and I spoke to him in a very collaborative tone. I need you, you need me, all the while, commending him to be very supportive business partner. And then actually also stressing that I really needed the deal to be closed. So I needed him to move fast. But that personal and respectful, approach shifted the dynamic completely because then, I mean, even today, I got a WhatsApp call from him. So our working relationship has improved and we're able to relate better. And then at that time, the deal was, concluded in record time. So it's building trust. The language is also helpful. It's not like a game changer because most Francophones now can, except very limited cases where they don't speak any English at all. But once they find that you have something in common with them, you speak a language that they can identify, you're able to build trust and respect. The African context, respect is very, very key, especially in the way, you relate to them. And I think that for me is, what has helped me manage my relationship with stakeholders. Yeah.
Yeah, great to hear. So that, leveraging that commonality. I'm going to come to you, Lamise, with a slightly different question. Before I do, I'm just looking in the chat and I've had 3 words. So I know we have more than 3 people in the audience. I would really love for people just to give us one word that encapsulates how culture impacts you in your workplace? Because actually, this is the whole purpose of doing this. This is not just about the panelists sharing their stories, but this is something that we're genuinely interested in hearing from you. So please take a second and just pop a word in the chat for me. Okay, Lemise, your journey, I mean, you've had a really interesting journey. So I know you've worked in SA, you did a stint in the UK, you're now back in SA. You're working for one of the world's most recognizable companies. I know you had a couple of years working at Reckitt here in the UK. How have you managed to bring your African perspective, particularly given what you described at the beginning about your own personal background and culture? How have you managed to bring those perspectives into multinational conversations? What does it mean to fully show up as Lemise in a global tech space when you don't look or sound like anybody else? And I would love you to kind of give us some real practical insights about how you're doing that.
So I think it's, again, I bring the context of, finding common ground, building community. But I will say that effective leadership in any position, in any role, in any company relies on the ability to persuade others. And you have to adapt your persuasive technique to your audience. And I think as an African lawyer, how I show up is, I think we are very flexible and we are very fluid in terms of how we think, how we problem solve. We're very creative and innovative. And that comes from working in an emerging market where you are working with, growing, navigating diverse economics, diverse cultures, and diverse business environments. So you have to be flexible because you are working in a space where you have the room to lobby, the room to mold and shape laws, the room to form part of case precedent. And then moving into a more multinational space where things are not as flexible, where there's very set practices, there's a set playbook, there's a set way of responding to different scenarios, and everything is quite modified. And then even further, when working in the UK, in a very developed market where, as Bayo mentioned, there are very exacting standards, very clear expectations and frameworks, you find yourself in the situation where you're now struggling to navigate across cultures and across business practices and across all kinds of different dimensions. And for me, how I show up is I try to find the connection. I try to build the relationships. I try to grow my network. I will often build a lot of relationships outside the boardroom before I even get inside the boardroom. And I use the flexibility of being an African lawyer who's able to navigate different, ever-changing kind of diverse environments to my advantage in order to do that. And I found it was a skill set that served me well when I was in the UK, because often, when faced with something, unexpected in an emergency, it's that quick thinking ability that you have as an African lawyer that really, helps you and keeps you in good stead.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent point. So just, I'm going to switch slightly because I want to make sure that we cover as much of what we plan to talk about today. I want to look at effective cross-border collaboration, what it looks like in practice. Bayo, I'm going to come to you because as I said, I was saying to the panelists before we started, I've been waiting to ask Bayo this question since I left Norton Rose Fulbright in 2017. So Bayo, I know, you're working at the highest levels of some of these cross-border deals. I remember when you joined the firm, I remember the excitement about having, someone like you. And it's been really inspiring, I have to say, just to see the trajectory of your career. I really want to hear from you. What are some of your practical tips or insights on working as an African lawyer, developing that credibility on deals, both international and African, but then avoiding being boxed as the Africa person? Because I think this is a real concern for people. I have a friend who's a partner in a firm, and I know that, you know, they've deliberately avoided doing Africa work in order to avoid being known as just the Africa person. So it can go the other extreme. What's your take on this whole discourse? Oh, you're muted and we need to hear this.
It's a really good question, Cynthia. So for me, leading with technical proficiency and experience is paramount. I don't lead with being an African lawyer. I lead with the fact that I have the knowledge and the expertise to support you. And I think that way, the Africa question sort of is secondary. I have a wealth of experience that I have gained as an African and also being dual qualified, having done law school in Nigeria. You know, just by way of background, I came to England when I was like 7 years old. I did all my education in the UK. I went back to Nigeria and I did law school because I expected to live and sort of die in Nigeria. But Nigeria wasn't really following the script at the time. So I found myself back in the UK. And so there is a part of me that is just intrinsically Nigerian. I still speak Yoruba. Outside of the context of these 4 walls here at Norton Rose Fulbright, I'm about as Nigerian as you get. I tell people I'm an area boy. So if you can't keep on looking at me like this, I will sell you and I'll keep the change. So that is just fundamentally who I am and who's in me. And so when I'm working on a deal, first and foremost is your technical competence and your proficiency. And then the fact also that you are Nigerian or you are African, you understand the laws or you understand the issues that you face executing transactions in those jurisdictions, the regulations. You are able to support your clients, hold their hands in the transactions that they're investing in, that they're looking to execute. So I think that is really sort of the best way to avoid being boxed. People will always underestimate you in meetings. And I think by the end of the meeting, they realize that actually, no, he's not an African lawyer. He's just a good lawyer. And I think that's just the most important thing.
Brilliant. Lamise, I see you shaking your head furiously. So I would love for you to also throw in some thoughts on that, and also the whole idea of, you know, you're in Amazon SA, that's a regional voice. You've got to speak, you know, within a global org. How do you avoid being just seen as the African, as Bayo's described?
So I'm shaking my head furiously because something that Bayo said resonated with me, where he said, you know, you're always underestimated in these situations. And I have found that to be a huge strength in most negotiations and disputes. You go in being underestimated, and often you're, you know, sometimes I'm the only woman, sometimes I'm the only person of color, sometimes I'm the youngest person in the room. And these are things that I use to my advantage. So I fully agree with Bayo over there and his sentiments. In terms of showing up in a global role and not trying to be boxed in, I think it's tricky to navigate, but I think essentially wherever you go, you have to understand the cultural context of the environment in which you're operating in. And I think that is quite a crucial skill set as a leader. When you show up in a role, whether it's an international role, a regional role, when you're leading a team, when you're dealing with customers or other stakeholders from across the world. So I think navigating it is tricky, but again, Bayo said this as well. He said, essentially, your expertise will speak for itself. Essentially, your work always speaks for itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, it's not just on a transactional level, Cynthia. What I try to do whenever I go to Lagos or, you know, Nairobi or wherever it might be, is to, again, take my technical expertise with me to try and give training and development to African companies, whether I'm talking to them about lockbox mechanisms or other sort of price adjustments, whether I'm talking to them about W&I insurance. I want them to come away thinking, okay, he's one of us, but he knows as much as them. And that is really like, that's always been what I have led with. I have found amazing support in my career from our community, because what they see and what they get from me is somebody who knows the law, is able to support them as good as John Smith, but also I'm an African, and I will fight harder actually for them to protect their interests than John Smith will. And so they're very comforted by that notion that, you know, not only are they working with an African, which is, you know, win-win, but then there is no compromise in the quality of work that they're getting. And if you take that also to your clients and you give them training, and you'll find that, oh, you know, Owando will tell Seplat that, oh, Bayo gave us a training on SPAs. You go see Seplat, they want the same training.
Love that. Leading with value. I think your quote, so he's one of us, but he knows as much as them. I think you need to, you know, get IP on that, because I'm about to put that on a t-shirt. I think that's so clever, but it's absolutely true. I mean, that is in itself a strategy. Timi, I want to come to you quickly because, you know, you've had the advantage, and to be honest, this was one of the reasons I wanted you on this session. So I as I said to you, I heard you speaking at the BCF conference. It's not very often that you hear someone, particularly in this context, that's done the in-house role now that they're a law firm. You know, you've got that full lens, that full perspective. Tell us what, from your point of view, are the key ingredients for successful legal collaboration between in-house and private practice. And I'd also love you to speak to some of the mistakes that you see people making, right? So as a client, perhaps, or even as the law firm, because I don't want this just to be a conversation about all the stuff that is happening correctly. I also want us to learn from some of the mistakes and the errors that get made.
All right. Thank you very much. So first of all, there's nothing wrong with being the African in the room, right? You know, so that we just put that into context. I mean, so I understand, you know, some lawyers may not want to be boxed in a corner and then be the African lawyer, you know, as has been suggested. But frankly speaking, you know, there are just so much opportunities on the continent that I think it is an advantage, and there's really nothing wrong with being an African lawyer or being seen as an African lawyer. So come to your question. Now, in terms of what I've seen, both at the bank as GC of the bank, and then now in private practice, be switching over the roles to the other side, I would say that a track record of expertise is non-negotiable, right? You know, and I think all the panelists agree with that, you know, that there's just no, in my experience, a demonstrable track record of expertise in the jurisdiction, especially, you know, and including knowledge of local regulations, they're just non-negotiable, right? So that was always very high on my list, and is still high on the list of various clients that I work for. The other thing is about a strong knowledge of the operating environment, right? And I feel that this is really where, you know, African lawyers can actually really do have an advantage, and they can play up that advantage quite well. So what I mean by that is that you would prefer to have in your deals lawyers who have an appreciation of cultural nuances, right? You know, which is essential for effective communication. It allows you to be able to build trust. with your clients very quickly. So as a practical example, I would always prefer to, on my deals, whilst I was still general counsel, that the supervising partner on any of the matters that I'm giving out would actually really be someone who has a knowledge of that operating environment, right? So whereas you may have associates who are working on the deals who may never have stepped foot in Africa before, it would always be that at least the supervising partner, it's someone that I can actually really relate with. And then I am also aware that to get on the panel of some development finance institutions on the continent now, it's not just enough for you to have the token Black person within the team. They actually really want to see Black people in senior positions, and that very often is now coming across as a strong condition for you to be able to get on the panel. I also value, strong collaboration with local law firms, right? Because on some matters, in fact, by statute, for instance, in dispute-related matters, you would have to have a local counsel that would be working on the matter and alongside an international counsel. So it would be key, and a key requirement for the international counsel to be one that is able to develop or has a collaboration with local firms. So those are the practical points that we used to consider and are still very relevant even now.
Yeah, great shares. No, thank you for that, Timi. I'm very conscious of time, but I do want to make sure that we allow time for Q&A. So we're probably going to run to, I think we said 1:15, but we may make it 10 past. We're gonna the last part of this discussion is around burnout, which I think is such an important topic. Sharon is going to lead the moderation of this session. We've also got a poll that we wanted to run, so we might do that. We'll see how we go. But if I can encourage people whilst the panel are giving their shares on burnout, if you have questions, if you can start putting them in the Q&A, because again, this is a conversation, right? We set these sessions up because we want to hear from particular speakers, but also because we want to hear from the audience. We want to know, whether you have commentary on something that's been said, or whether you actually have a burning question that you really want somebody to give you some real thought and insight into. So if I could encourage you now to start putting your questions in the chat, and we will come to those, or in the Q&A, sorry, and we will come to those after this last part of the discussion. Sharon, over to you.
Thanks, Cynthia. And that was a great discussion. I think it may have covered some of the points that I was going to ask about. But so in terms of burnout, I'm not going to talk about the hours that you work, because I can imagine that, you guys are all under relentless pressure and just working really long hours and traveling across the continent, traveling between Europe and internationally and so on. So I can imagine that hard work is the order of the day. But what I did want to talk to you about, and I think maybe Timi might have covered this a little bit, but it's just really about how do you navigate the pressure that you're under to prove yourself. And it may be that in the context in which you're working, that isn't an issue. But if it is, I'd really love to hear your views on that, because I know, for example, working as a Black lawyer in the UK context, that is something that a lot of people talk about. I'd love to hear what your experiences have been.
Right. Thank you very much. So on that, I've got 3 main recommendations. So the first one is that, and I think Bayo said it before previously, actually, you have to be the best at what you do, right? So I cannot overemphasize that point. There is simply no substitute for excellence, right? It speaks for you. So in my experience, just really knowing your stuff gives you a dose of confidence that, I don't think anything else would actually really give to you. And constantly reminding yourself what you bring to the table, right? In my experience, that's been really useful, right? You've done so much to get to the table. No one is doing you a favor, right? And actually you're there because you deserve to be there, right? So really having really very strong mental attitude. And in my case, without sounding very immodest, actually most times everybody else is in the room because of me. So I'm the one who brought in the table, right? And so the last one is just making sure you develop a mental attitude that actually, and I do this a lot, because more often than not, I find myself being the only one who looks like me in the room, right? So whereas you may be the only one in this room, right? There are 15% of the world's population actually looks like you, right? So, don't get caught up. You're not as alone as you actually really think, that, anyway, so that's the way.
The global majority, Timi.
Correct.
The global majority. I think you're so right that, having that technical excellence really allows you to surpass and also helps with your self-talk, because you were talking about, positively talking. If you know that you know your stuff, that gives you that confidence. Absolutely agree. Thank you, Timi. Lareine, Sandra, Bayo, would you like to comment on that question? Bayo, you're on mute. Thank you.
I think on burnout, it's a really interesting question. The one thing that I love about our profession is that you can choose the speed at which you're going to work, right? You can decide that you want to go to a US law firm and do 2,200 hours. You can go to a Magic Circle firm and do, maybe 10, 20% less. You can go to a top 10, top 20 firm and again, correspondingly less. You can choose your area of practice. I think the issue more often than not that I have found with African lawyers and lawyers of Afro-Caribbean background is that we're our own worst enemies. We want to work. We were built to work. We feel like we are so elastic that nothing will break. At least when I go home, my wife just sort of shakes her head at me that, okay, you're off on a plane again to South Africa or Lagos or Accra, another deal, blah, blah, blah. When are you going to stop? When is enough enough? I can't self-regulate. And I think that actually is the more important question, is how we teach ourselves to self-regulate. How do we tell ourselves that actually this is not sustainable? Because of our cultures, we're made to believe that you have to seize every opportunity. You have to have 3, 5, 6 degrees. You have to be the best. And I think on this panel, we've all talked and emphasized the importance of technical excellence and expertise. And so we drive ourselves to levels that are quite often unsustainable. But, we need to choose for ourselves what gear we want to be in, to what levels we want to work. And we also have to look out for each other because, we don't really know when it is that we're near the breaking point. I think my wife has literally stopped asking me to slow down because she knows that this car has no brake.
Wow. So self-regulation, Bayo, I think that's a really good point. That internalized pressure that we have culturally, but also because we're a minority in this country anyway, in the UK, that leads to that internalized pressure that needs
that desire. We're told that in order for us to excel or to achieve in this environment, we must work twice as hard as our counterpart. And it may be true, and it probably is. And we literally take that on board that, okay, well, if they're going to do 10, I'm going to do 20. And so obviously at some point, we're going to burn out. And I think actually it's another thing that we need to address to make sure that we are on the same footing. There is an equality that Black associates and Black lawyers do not feel this pressure to have to work twice as hard to achieve the same thing as a white associate or a white partner.
Absolutely true. And that's why, you know, for Cynthia and I, we're all about spreading the word about working smart, not just hard, you know, because we can see that the mental health and the physical health consequences of overwork, and particularly in the legal profession, and across for any, it affects anybody, all, you know, people of all backgrounds. But as you say, for us bioculturally, it's a particular problem. So thank you so much for that. Sandra, were you going to comment on that?
You know, the comment, the statement Timi made about proving yourself, like, and we need to change that mindset, right? About constantly like trying to say we have to prove our worth. You're already qualified. That's why you have a seat at a table. So, and again, it goes back to, you know, documenting what you bring to the table. And I call it a brag sheet, you know, where you keep track of all your recommendations, all the advice you've given, the successful outcomes, because nobody's going to tell your story for you. You're the only one who can shout it as loud as ever, so that nobody gets it forgotten and then attributes your success or your advice to somebody else. So I would say have a brag sheet, document your contributions, and also prepare differently. You know, we've been made to believe that you need to know everything. Yes, know your areas of expertise deeply, but also be comfortable to say, I'll get back to you on things that are outside of your scope, so that you don't feel like always the pressure. I have to know it all, and then trying to cover every possible question and then take on more than that is necessary. So for me, I think that is what I need to do in the situation where I find myself, where it feels like I have to prove myself. We don't need to.
Oh, I love that, Sandra. I love the idea of the brag sheet, sort of documenting what you've achieved as you go along, and kicking off with that when you meet people. I've done this and I've done that. I love that. And you're so right about not internalizing, not knowing everything, not using that to attack oneself, because, you know, as a GC in your position, you're not supposed to know everything, right? You're there to be a leader. So love that. Fantastic. Thank you. Lamise, did you want to jump in on that before we switch to the Q&A?
Just very quickly, I think I echo what the other panelists have said about, you know, having a strong sense of identity, feeling your best in order to be your best. And then something you said, Sharon, around, you know, working smart. And I just want to add, around working smart, look for sponsors who can help brag for you and who will speak up for you in rooms where you are not present. And also leverage off your community in terms of networking, because I have found that has also been an invaluable resource.
Those are great points, Lamise. Absolutely, absolutely crucial, aren't they? Both of them to progressing in any career, but particularly in the law, where, you know, we're selling ourselves. So we're not selling a product. It's all about us as individuals selling our expertise and our backgrounds, our personalities. So thank you so much for those points. Does anyone have a question? I can't see any questions in the box. I don't know if I'm missing them.
There are 3 in the Q&A. I can read them out if you can't see them.
Oh, in the Q&A, right? I'm looking.
They're in the Q&A.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking in the web chat, so that's
Okay.
my fault. So, right, so the first question is for Max Canoti, and it's, what are some mistakes law firms should avoid as they aim to improve cross-continental alliances? Bayo and Timi, I think it's probably a good one for you, for you both to respond to.
Again, I think partnership, coming with an attitude and approach that you are going to work collaboratively and in partnership with local law firms is really important. I think historically there has been a tendency in sort of major city law firms to see local lawyers as somehow being a sort of junior partner in the whole sort of transaction or in the equation. There is quite often such a sad disparity in fees and compensation. And I think we need to do better as international law firms in both how we work with our partners in African law firms, how we ensure that there is a more even distribution of compensation for the transaction and that they are properly rewarded for the work that they do. And I think importantly as well, we have a responsibility to share knowledge and to transfer knowledge. And I know Cynthia is doing great things with the ACGC. There are other platforms like ILFA. And I think it's a really important aspect of everything that we do to make sure that we are transferring knowledge, and rather than sort of keeping it as intellectual property that we will continue to monetize.
Thank you, Bayo. Those are 3 great points, and so important, I think, to make that investment back into partner firms in Africa. Brilliant. Thank you. Timi, do you want to just jump in on that as well? Or I'm happy to go on to the next question. Do you have a perspective on that?
Okay, so there's only one addition that I would say to what Bayo has already said. So there is some perception that I've seen that African clients may not, working for African clients may not be completely profitable, right? So which drives low investments into the region, right? By law firms. I don't think that is true, and certainly from my experience, that's just not correct, right? So I check usually with a number of law firms. So where you're likely to see this manifest is where they have offices, right? So a lot of law firms have offices all across the globe, right? In Latin America, in America, in Europe. And when it comes to Africa, they have a desk in London and another desk in Paris. That's it. I think that really should be changing, because there are a number of, it's a growing region. There's a lot of investment that's going there. And I think it would be a mistake to actually really miss out, on the opportunities that abounds on the continent. So that really would be my comment.
But when is Squire, Patton, Boggs opening in Lagos, Timi?
Oh,
you want to get me into trouble, right? But
dear.
it should change. It should change. That idea should change.
I think, and it's a bit like going back to that Economist article that report that they did earlier in the year. They just, because of some of the narratives and missing out on, the youngest population in the world. There are huge business opportunities there. And I've heard also about this issue about rate disparity between African work and other jurisdictions. So it's great that you quashed that rumor, Timi. Thank you very much for that. The next question is, how do you navigate issues around compensation and remuneration? Sometimes, in spite of how excellent you are, if you are working from Africa for an international firm, compensation is most often not at par with international counterparts outside the continent. So, that might have something to do with the rates. I don't know. Do you want to, who would like to comment on that? Bayo, I can't hear. I think I can see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you.
I think that's probably one for Timi or myself. I think, look, we have offices in South Africa and in Casablanca. And there is a rate across South African law firms, the South African lawyers. So it's not that you're underpaying them. They are getting very well paid for that market. The cost of living in Johannesburg is considerably less than the cost of living in London. the cost of rent in Santon is a fraction of what the cost of rent is in the City of London. You know, by the same margin, what London lawyers get paid compared to New York lawyers is also probably an underpayment. So it's really an economic factor. It's not so much that you know, you're getting paid less for the same work. You're getting paid the market rate for the work that you're doing. And I don't think that you can really sort of do it in any other way. What I do find interesting though, and I think again, this is something that I would love to explore more with Nigerian law firms, is that a lot of Nigerian law firms really do tend to underpay their associates and their associate body. I think, and it's not just Nigeria. I'm just using Nigeria as an example. I think that because quite often there is quite a large supply of lawyers, there is the ability to pay them quite poorly. And I do think actually that one of the things I would like to see working with local law firms is helping improve the terms and conditions and the pay of firms within the law firms that we partner with on the continent, to ensure that there is a much more equal distribution and fair compensation that are paid to lawyers. I would like to make it a condition of me engaging you as my correspondent firm in Nairobi or my correspondent firm in Lagos, that you are treating your own staff fairly. And it's not just the partners within those top 5, top 10 firms in Lagos that are making multi-millions, because they can charge significant rates, but then pay poorly to their own staff. So just to be controversial.
Thank you for your honesty, Bayo. That's something that I, didn't have any knowledge of. So that's really, really interesting. The question of supply and demand, really, and how that's impacting local market salaries. But I liked what you said about, insisting, a bit like the modern slavery legislation, where you sort of look through the supply chain and see how people are being treated. I think, taking on that kind of proactive approach will definitely fix this problem. But great answer. Thank you. Have we got any more time to go through the rest of these, Cynthia?
I think we're fine as long as people are happy to stay on. We've got a fair few people on and people are asking questions. So as long as our panelists are happy to give us another 5 or 10 minutes, that would be great. I do think these are great questions, so it would be good to cover.
Yeah, amazing.
I can stay on till 1:45, and then I got another call. So
okay,
yeah.
we won't be that long. No. Right, so this is from George. Good evening from Kenya, and thank you for this session. Mine was to get to know from you all how easy, difficult it is to transition to the UK market. I'm planning on sitting for the SQE2 since I'm a Kenyan advocate and was curious to know this. Thank you so much. Any views on that? Any experience or knowledge on transitioning from Africa into the UK?
I'll take that one.
Thank you, Lamise.
So I've done this before, and fairly recently, so I can answer and say from my experience, the skill sets are quite easily transferable. It's also dependent on the type of law that you practice, but certainly taking the SQE and being a duly qualified lawyer is a huge advantage. So highly recommend it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. The next question is, how does one deal with a career setback? And this is something that we like to address at BCF. How does one deal with a career setback in the current employment climate, particularly as a Black junior lawyer? Who would like to take that one? I don't know what kind of career setback is being referred to, but we can use our imaginations, right?
I think if it's a performance-related issue, there is a sort of level of honesty that is going to be required where you evaluate whether or not you are the right person for that firm and what type of firm you would be the right person in, where your level of expertise and knowledge will be commensurate to the type of work that they are doing, the type of clients that they have. Now, it's possible that there may have been some unfair prejudice. In the absence of sort of unfair prejudice, the individual having been treated unfairly, which has probably happened to all of us here on this panel. I think, you know, it's important for the individual, the person that's raised a question, to actually really consider, you know, what's the right type of firm for them to be in, where they will actually be valued and their sort of skill sets and knowledge will be sort of reflective and will be valued. The prejudice thing is a really tough one. My only answer to that is, like, again, just pick yourself up and go again. You know, hopefully you get the right organization that will value. But I think we've all had some element of prejudice in our career where, you know, hugely disappointing, but you just got to dust yourself off and go again. And I've had a few, and hopefully, well, I mean, you see me here, so.
Yeah, no, I like that, particularly in terms of finding the right firm and making sure that, you know, you've got those mentors and those sponsors, because going in a firm without support, it's not really sustainable in the long term. So, Cynthia, did you want to address that question as well? Thank you, by the way, for that, Bayo.
I wasn't going to. Oh, can you
Oh,
hear me?
okay. Maybe I saw something on the screen, but it was just
No, go ahead. We've got
a
three.
bit of misinformation there.
No, that's we've got three more questions, and there's one that's
I
from
was gonna,
yeah.
okay, I was going to combine the next two, because one is, how is it best to leverage your network, especially when looking for new opportunities, and what is the best way to approach leaders? And the other one was, as a junior lawyer of Caribbean descent, what would you say is one effective way to start building relationships with legal professionals or institutions in this space, given that I'm not yet in a senior client-facing role? So I think if we take those two questions together, it'd be really interesting to hear from our panelists around any very specific practical tips you can give around networking, looking for new opportunities, building relationships.
Okay, here I go again. For me, I think at the early stages of your career, focus on learning the law and just being a really, really good lawyer. There's this tendency to think that you have to bring in business. I think within most organizations, there are some, you know, long-standing clients, annuity clients, and your job is to provide them with the best legal advice. There are partners whose responsibility it is to manage those relationships. There are partners whose responsibility it is to generate opportunities. And the focus for you really very early on in your career is to really just soak everything in, learn, get on the deals, get on the deals. The way you become an outstanding lawyer is by doing a really good job on the project or the case on which you have been put. And then you get the opportunity to work on the next one that comes along. The more you do, the better the lawyer you will be. And, you know, then as you go through, you will meet people within the relevant client organizations that you can stay in touch with, you can have coffees with, you can have lunches with. In a way, a lot of this is just, it's a natural progression that you will meet people through the work that you do. The other way to meet new clients and to connect with new opportunities is to actively go out and search for them, people you may not have worked for at conferences, or if you are traveling, let's say, to Nigeria, to go meet various banks or corporates or law firms. But I think both the questionnaires in this case I get the impression that you're still relatively young. I think for now, focus on getting the next project from the partners that you're working for and actually smashing it till they filter you on the next project, and then you become a really good lawyer.
I love that, Bayo. I completely agree that in the early years, building out those technical skills is just absolutely vital. And yeah, I agree. It's through the work and through the deals that you get put on. And you're right, you know, that's where you make some really great relationships, isn't it? On those deals that where you're pulling those all-nighters, you can build some great relationships there. So getting selected by the partner or the work allocation partner, whoever it is, to go on to some of the best clients is something that to really focus on. Thank you for that, Bayo. Does anybody else want to comment on that before
Yes.
I jump? Timi, thank you, Timi.
Yes. All right. So what I always advise is, especially for lawyers with, Africa or Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, that you should develop a genuine interest in the region, right? So I've always been very surprised at the level of, for a lot of Black lawyers that I've seen, simply really just a level of disconnect and lack of knowledge about Africa that I see, among Black lawyers, about the opportunities that abound in the continent. So for a lot of Black lawyers, in my view, Africa should be seen as a place of your comparative advantage, right? And you should actually really exploit. I also think you should try and build meaningful connections. And when I first came to the UK and I was working for the FTSE listed company, we didn't have organizations such as BCF, or, that there weren't too many of those avenues for people to make genuine connections. But I think now the lay of the land has changed. It has improved quite significantly, and I think people really should get involved. So I found participating in initiatives as the Black Counsels Forum, the Black Solicitors Network, the British Nigerian Law Forum, right, has been very useful in terms of really just even seeing a huge gathering of Black lawyers, and very invaluable to being able to foster relationships. I will also say, and I think Bayo had mentioned it, that you should get involved in, if you're in private practice, that you should show interest in joining the Africa Practice Group, right? It's a no-brainer. You should really show interest in joining the Africa Practice Group and get involved in the work that they're doing. And this is the last one I'm going to say. I recognize that it's not for everyone, but certainly what has been made such a huge impact on my own career trajectory. So if you have any opportunity, right, to be able to spend some time on the continent in a legal role, so be that could come through a short-term role, temporary role, a secondment, or a permanent role, any of those sort of opportunities would assist you in terms of being able to really have a knowledge of, the jurisdiction, the legal knowledge, and also help you to build really good relationships as well, which would assist you further down the road.
I love that, Timi. Thank you so much. And it's a great way to wrap up, actually, because you're talking about that unique culture we can make. And I think, with the whole sort of anti-D&I pushback going on, it's even more important that we use the advantages that we've got, take advantage of the relationships that we have, the knowledge that we have in the places, where our heritage is from. So thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Sandra, to Lamise, to Bayo, to Timi. You've been incredible. So much knowledge has been shared in the past hour and a bit, and I'm sure that everybody who has joined to participate has really taken away lots of nuggets. So I'd like to say thank you to our host Cynthia, for doing an incredible job of moderating this panel and coming up with the talking points. And thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.